IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. How's the sound, Trev? We all set? We ready to rock and roll?
We're set, man. You're coming through loud and clear, brother.
Y'all.
Oop. Might have gone out on you there for a second, Bryan. Uh-oh. Headphones might have to be turned off.
All right. So now we all set? Okay.
Hear you. Loud and clear.
There we go. So the wild weekend continues. The wild week continues, y'all. It's been a wild couple days. So I'm in Lime, Ohio. I'm here in town for my grandma's viewing today and funeral tomorrow. But you know what? Got some big time action going on tonight, Trev. The college football playoff is getting released tonight, my man, and we're going to be going live here. Well, we are live now, but we'll be going live to the review. They're finishing up the Memphis-Michigan State game right now. Once that is over, they're going to go to the playoff rankings, and we're going to talk about those as they're announced, and we'll talk about what they mean for just big picture. We'll talk about what they mean for Notre Dame and just kind of break it all down. It's going to be a lot of fun, Trev. And, man, crazy weekend, crazy week. And we're going to find out a lot tonight, Trev, because this past weekend really shook things up, man. There's no doubt about that.
I think you said it perfectly a couple shows ago, is sometimes it's the weekends in college football that you expect nothing from are some of the craziest weekends in college football. So, I guess note to self for future shows, when you and Bill Bender get on and talk about how it's going to be a boring weekend of college football, keep that in your back pocket, because it's definitely going to be a crazy weekend. Just what history tells us this year, man. But it's a crazy week. We got the holiday week coming up. Thursday, Thanksgiving is one of my favorite holidays. But before we hop into it today, Bryan, speaking of Thanksgiving, there's no better way to celebrate Thanksgiving outside of being with family and people that you're thankful for than with our friends over at MyBookie. So this week for Thanksgiving, get ready to stuff your wallets with MyBookie, because they have a bunch of awesome promos that are going on. So on Thanksgiving Day, what MyBookie is doing is they're boosting the odds for a Devon A-Chain to score the first touchdown in the Dolphins versus Packers game on Thanksgiving Day. If he scores first, you cash in big. But for whatever reason, if he doesn't, what MyBookie is going to do for you is they're going to give you a full refund. So it's a no sweat bet. Another thing that MyBookie did starting yesterday is MyBookie's Telegram prize pool contest kicks off. So the pool starts at $15,000 and grows by $5,000 for every 1,000 new subscribers. All you have to do is join the Telegram channel by December 1st to lock in your share. And if you're already subscribed, you're automatically in, which is awesome. In addition to that, be sure to sign up for their rewards program. It's going to give you extra cash just for placing bets. And another thing that they're going to do for you still is when you sign up using promo code IRISH, they're going to double your deposit bonus. So bet anything, anytime, anywhere with our friends over at MyBookie.
So, Trev, how do I sound now? We all set?
Beautiful as ever.
All right, my man. We got it going, rocking and rolling. So, yes, people, I do have hair. I keep telling you guys this. I do have hair. I wear hats because I like hats. I don't wear hats because I'm bald. So I do have a head of hair. We're going to start talking about things as the basketball game is over. There's 2:52 left in the game, which means we probably got a good 45 minutes to talk about this past weekend, the way that the last 2 minutes of college basketball games tend to go. But, Trev, look, kind of as you preview these upcoming rankings, last week it was kind of like we knew exactly how it was going to go, right? I mean, Georgia got beat by Ole Miss. We knew everybody's going to kind of slide up. You and I predicted that they would just kind of block the SEC teams, would just kind of move up as is, or they would move up as is. This week, man, total chaos this past weekend. And it was funny because we were talking about, I was so fired up that Notre Dame was ahead of the SEC teams last week because we said, look, they don't have any big games left. Bama's got Oklahoma and Auburn. Ole Miss has Florida and Mississippi State. Georgia's got UMass and Georgia Tech. The Georgia Tech game was really the only one you looked at and said, hey, that might be a game to keep your eye on. And then, of course, we'd learned a lot about Ohio State and Indiana. We certainly did. And then we go out and Bama not only loses to Oklahoma, They get smacked by Oklahoma. Ole Miss not only loses to Florida, well, they just lost to Florida. It was a competitive game. They lost to Florida. Indiana gets blown out by Ohio State, and then Penn State almost loses, Trev. So let's first talk about, when you look at how last week goes, the team to me that had the worst weekend, in my opinion, is Ole Miss. Now, they didn't have the worst loss, but I think the committee viewed them the least of the SEC teams, and them losing to a 5-5 Florida team, I think Ole Miss is done, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's been a lot of chatter around, what 3-loss SEC team is going to get into the playoffs. And Ole Miss essentially just kind of signed their ticket to play in a bowl game that is not a part of the 12-team college football playoff. I'm with you. I think they're up there. I think an argument could be made now for Alabama, specifically because of the fashion of how they lost, right? Because that game wasn't competitive. They lost by 21 points on the road. Yes, I understand they lost in Norman. This is not a good Oklahoma football team this year. It just isn't. There's no way around it. And right now, Alabama has one bad loss to Oklahoma and one not so great loss to Vanderbilt. Now, Vanderbilt is playing above people's expectations of what they are this year, which is awesome to see for Clark Lee. However, it's still not a team that Alabama should have lost to, especially in the fashion that they did, because it wasn't a fluky game. Vanderbilt was just able to move the ball up and down the field at will. They played really well. Don't want to take anything away from them. But Alabama is also up there for me, along with Ole Miss, for having the worst weekend, because the way that they lost was really, really bad.
The reason I went with Ole Miss is because I think they're going to get less benefit of the doubt from the committee. Now, I'm not saying that's right or fair, but like to your point about Alabama, I don't hurt them losing to Ole Miss or Vanderbilt doesn't hurt me. I'd be hypocritical if I was going to be like them having a bad loss to a 6-5 team. They're out because team you and I are pretty familiar with lost to a 6-5 team early in the year, and this, especially in this season, there's been a lot of those type of losses. It's the combination of two losses where they were clearly outplayed from start to finish. To your point, and then their third loss being to a good Tennessee team. But they have the bigger win. That Georgia win is huge for Alabama. The 34-point win over Missouri is huge for them. The thing that hurts South, and they also have a win over South Carolina.
Yeah.
The thing that hurts Ole Miss, in my opinion, is all three of their losses are bad. They lost to LSU. They lost to, obviously, this weekend to a 6-5 Florida team, and then they lost to a 4-7 Kentucky team. At least Bama can say all the teams that beat us are going to a bowl game.
Sure.
Ole Miss can't say that, right? And Notre Dame can say that. Ole Miss can't. And then when you look at Ole Miss's resume, they've got the win over South Carolina and Georgia. That's good. But I just think those three really bad losses are gonna hurt them a lot more, in my opinion, than what Alabama was. And again, Bama's Bama, fair or not, there is that blue blood bonus that they give people, which is exactly why Penn State is ranked where they're ranked at this point in time. So one of the things that we're going to find out tonight is just how big of a hit does Bama and Ole Miss take. And my thing is, the precedent has been set by the committee. What are they going to do? Georgia starts off number 3, and then they get beat by 18 to a good Ole Miss team. They dropped 9 spots. Bama gets beat by even more by a worse team in Oklahoma. How did they not drop pretty significantly? Do they drop the 7 to 9 spots, or do they drop more like Miami dropped, which is like 5 spots? It's going to be interesting to see how they do that. I think Bama should free fall. I mean, Trev, that was a bad loss.
Yeah.
And not just the bad loss in that they didn't play like Notre Dame had a terrible loss to Northern Illinois, but Notre Dame had multiple. They had a lead in the fourth quarter. They had a chance to win it at the end. You make one stop on defense. You have one drive on offense. You win that game. They were out of that game from start to finish.
Yeah.
And Ole Miss can say the same thing. Ole Miss can say, hey, look, we lost last second to Kentucky. We lost in overtime to LSU, and we had 2 chances at the end of that game to tie it against Florida. Bama basically got whooped twice, and so, but I just don't know that the committee's going to view it that way. But I'm very curious to see how they're going to treat that tonight, Trev. Do they hammer Bama the way they should? I just don't think that they are, but I hope that I'm wrong, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I'm with you, man. It's going to be interesting to see what the committee does with Bama, but I think you hit the nail on the head, man. It was an ugly, ugly game. And I'm not saying that the Northern Illinois loss wasn't an ugly loss, because it was, right? It was a very ugly loss. Yes, they were competitive and had a chance to win at the end against Northern Illinois, right? But when you go and you even look at just how the game was played, Alabama was held scoreless for 3 quarters. They kicked a field goal in the first. They were scoreless quarters 2 through 4. Jalen Milroe was under 50% completion. He had 3 interceptions, no touchdowns. His QBR for the day was 15.4, which I know is not a stat that is really tracked that much in college football, but that's low. For anybody that doesn't know, that is really low. So it was just an ugly game overall. But I'm going to be really interested to see where they put those teams. I mean, how far does Alabama fall? Are they going to get the benefit of the doubt of, they are Alabama and we've seen them compete with playoff teams? Because that is the other thing, to your point, that they have in their back pocket. Not that Ole Miss doesn't, but their losses carry a little bit more weight, to your point.
Mm-hmm.
But for Alabama, you say, well, hey, listen, South Carolina's ranked. They beat them. Georgia's ranked. They beat them. They battled Tennessee. Yeah. So it's just going to be one of those where, are they going to err more on the side of, now that the committee is kind of coming to the end of essentially their job of voting the playoff rankings, are they going to start erring on the side of, we are just going to pick the 12 teams that we believe have the opportunity to compete for a national championship? Or are you going to do it based on who deserves it and who has the better resume and things like that? So that's going to be really interesting to see how it unfolds tonight.
A couple other things too, Trev, that happened this weekend. Obviously, Indiana got smacked by Ohio State. How does that? Started off well. They came out that first drive and put it on the board and had Ohio State in the third and, was it 3rd and 20 something? Ohio State gets a big gain on 3rd down, then they convert on 4th down and go down and score. And it looked like it might stay close for just a little bit, but it became obvious very early on that Indiana's offense couldn't do anything. And so now you look at it, where do they fall? Do they and nobody benefited more from the chaos this weekend than Indiana, in my opinion, because it's going to be real hard to convince people that a 1-loss Big Ten team should be below a bunch of 3-loss SEC teams.
100%.
It's going to be really hard to see how that happens. So I think that was huge for Indiana. Penn State's close win over Minnesota. Trev, you pointed out before the show, you said, we've seen precedent from the committee with Notre Dame back in 2015, a 1-loss Notre Dame team who had lost to a really good Clemson team who was ranked in the top 4, lost in the final seconds at Clemson. Notre Dame was ranked in the top 4, and then they had back-to-back struggle weeks against Wake Forest. They won 28-7 but played poorly, and then had an ugly 19-16 win over a bad BC team, and that dropped Notre Dame down. So we've seen precedent of teams falling down because even if they're winning because they're not playing well. And then how does the Notre Dame beat down over Army impact them? So that Notre Dame Penn State placement is going to be super interesting tonight, Trevor. Do they make that move this week, or do they wait to see what Notre Dame does against USC next week? And then also, where is Army going to be when this all comes out? Does Army fall completely out, or does Army stay in? But that Penn State Notre Dame is one that's going to be interesting to watch after we figure out what's going on with those SEC teams. Is this the week that Notre Dame passes out Penn State? Is it next week, or does it just never happen? We're going to get a little taste of that tonight as well.
I'm under the impression, and again, this is one of those things that I hope that I'm wrong in, right? But I feel as if Notre Dame doesn't pass up Penn State this week, then I don't think anything will. Only because if beating a ranked opponent in the top 20 who's undefeated by 35 points isn't enough to warrant Notre Dame passing up Penn State when they just beat, what were they? At the time, 6-4 Minnesota team by 1 point. I just don't know if anything will. I will hold out hope if Notre Dame goes into the Coliseum, the same place that Penn State played them in, and beats them by a better margin than 33-30 in overtime. Then maybe I think we could be having a very similar conversation next week. However, I just don't know if I have faith in the committee to put Notre Dame above Penn State if they don't do it this week after that big of a lopsided victory over an Army team. And it's one of those, and I know you guys talked about it on the post game. Notre Dame scored 49 points because they chose to score 49 points, right? That easily could have been a 60-point football game, but that's besides the point. I don't want to say they let their foot off the gas. It was just, it's time to put in the reserves and not take away from what was going on, everything else surrounding the game. But it's going to be interesting. With IU, if the committee does also look at eye test, the thing that's also going to be working against them is there was a clear athletic mismatch between IU and Ohio State. And that is something that really is going to hinder IU, in my opinion. I don't think it's going to drop them out of the playoff race, especially because of all the chaos that we've been talking about. Because to your point, I don't know if you can put IU below Bama. I mean, that would be a crazy precedent to set. But it's not like they lost a close game where they kind of battled tough. It was very clear that at the start of the second quarter, there was a very obvious lopsided advantage for athleticism and speed for Ohio State.
Yeah. Let me make that counter argument, though, just real quick. I could put myself in the committee's shoes and say, listen, we don't think there's a big difference between Notre Dame and Penn State. And I don't think they do. I mean, based on what Ward Manuel said this week during I think it was a conference call about Notre Dame and Penn State, it doesn't seem like there's a huge separation. You could say, hey, that difference in those wins were big, but you could also say, hey, listen, let's just see how that second common opponent goes next week. Because if Notre Dame does lead Penn State, then we can make that move next week, since Penn State's not, as of right now, not playing in the conference championship game. So
sure.
I could see them maybe saying, hey, let's wait 1 week. Let's see what kind of chaos happens in the Big Ten. Let's see how that common opponent thing goes, because it'd be easier to move Notre Dame down if they don't play well, but do you really want to move Notre Dame up and then move Notre Dame back? Just leave them where they are, see how Notre Dame plays next week, and then if they play well, you can leap them ahead of them. As opposed to, let's say Notre Dame wins next week, but it's uglier than the way Penn State did, which, because Penn State fell behind early, but the second half, they went right through USC in the second half. I mean, they were down 26 at halftime and ended up tying it up in the second half. So obviously, scored, outscored them 24-10 in the second half, right? So I could see them doing that, Trev. I personally, once you know. If you think Notre Dame's better now, move them ahead now. That's sure. So I agree with you that it should happen this week. I think it's very clear that Notre Dame is a better team than Penn State, in my opinion. The strength of schedule rankings, which I think are dramatically skewed because of how the weights they put on certain conferences, and I don't think certain conferences should be getting as much of an emphasis, especially when you consider it's so much harder to gauge strength of a conference now when you've got these 16 to 18 team leagues where a bunch of teams. I mean, there's such a huge difference between like Michigan's schedule in Indiana and Penn State's schedule, or Georgia's schedule compared to Ole Miss or Texas's schedule. Those things all factor into it. So I'm going to be curious to see how that shakes out. But Trev, what did this weekend mean for the SEC? And then here's another thing: the league that got the most bump from this chaos is the ACC. Because the ACC legit has a chance now to get a second team in. And if some real chaos happens, maybe even a third. Now, with Clemson having a shot to play South Carolina this weekend, SMU and Miami but having a chance to go into the title games with one loss each, there could be some real big jump from the ACC here. Now, the game is over. The top 25 is going to be announced here soon, Trev, but that is going to – I'm really curious to see where the eight – we talked about what happens with the SEC teams. What does that do for the rankings of the ACC teams? That's going to be a really intriguing part of this whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with Clemson. That's a team that I'm keeping my eye on, because depending on where these rankings fall, and if Clemson beats South Carolina, there's a scenario that Clemson can get into the playoffs without even having played in the conference championship game, right? Because you have SMU and Miami most likely, barring any sort of upset, probably playing in the ACC conference championship. So it's going to be really interesting to see where everybody falls in this week's rankings. I'm going to be really interested. I'm happy that the show is starting. You were not kidding. It was going to be 45 minutes until that game was over.
Yep. Dude, I've been watching a lot of college basketball over the years, man. And the last 2 minutes of games nowadays takes forever. I said that at the beginning of the show. We're now 20 minutes in, and they're just now going to the intro for the college football playoff rankings. But again, Trevor, we're going to find out. Now we're going to find out what happens at the bottom of the top 25 with certain teams. Does Does Indiana Army fall out? Does a team like Georgia Tech jump back in? Does a team like Louisville jump back in? How far do the SEC teams fall down? How do they manipulate the bottom 5 to boost resumes of teams in the top 5 and 10? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, that's all going to be interesting stuff. So, we're going to find out. I think the top 3, we kind of have a good sense of. It's going to be Oregon, Ohio State, and Texas. After that is when we might start to see a little bit of a shakeup. So, and I know people complain about Texas, and I understand that, but Texas to me has been very convincing in their victories. And beating Kentucky 31-14 is not going to be something that's going to get you to fall down in your rankings. No, Kentucky's not very good, but Kentucky gave Georgia a game. They beat Ole Miss, and they gave Tennessee a game. And Texas went down and beat them convincingly. So I don't see Texas being a team that's going to fall out now. That's going to come down to the Texas A&M game or the title game. So we'll get down here. We'll get down here in a little bit and dive into that. I'm talking about overall, guys. When you look at how Texas has played this year, they have been far more convincing in their victories this year than a lot of other teams. So we'll announce as they go. We'll kind of follow the ESPN's lead for however they kind of go through it and announce it. We'll release them, and then we'll just kind of talk about them when they take little pauses. We'll take pauses and just kind of talk about the initial rankings. But Trevor, it's that time, man. Like, these things start to matter a whole lot more now.
Yep. Sure does.
And start to matter a whole lot more now. There's just less. I shouldn't say there's less opportunities for teams to fall out because of what we just saw last week, but there's just less opportunities for teams to get beat after this weekend, especially for Notre Dame, since this is their last weekend to play. They don't get a championship game weekend, and I'm okay with that. I'm good with that. I'm just saying, like, this is the last weekend. This is the last weekend, and we're going to find it out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the last weekend for a handful of teams, like teams that are also fighting for an at-large bid. So that's going to be interesting. I just mentioned Clemson. This is most likely, barring another upset in the ACC, this is Clemson's last opportunity to make an impact on the committee. And they have an awesome opportunity to do it over South Carolina, a team that might move up a little bit higher than what I think they're 18th right now. So, yeah, they have the opportunity to move up.
Did higher. I see that if Miami loses, Miami's the one that would fall out, not SMU? Did I read that correctly?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. That's going to be interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Now they're doing all their talking. Get to the rankings, fellas. We don't care what any of you think, especially you, Reese Davis. So here comes the top 25, Trev. Number 25 is Colorado. They fell down from 16 to 25 this weekend. So, but they remain in the top 25. Number 24, Kansas State. So that's a new team back in. So I have a feeling that might not bode well for Army. Because I thought if Army's going to stay in, they'd be around 24, 25. 23 is Illinois. So the Illinois Fighting Illini are still there at 23. I'll be a little surprised if Army stays in, Trev, at this point in time, to be honest with you. But, I've been wrong before, my man. I've been wrong before. So, let's see. 22 is UNLV. The Running Rebels are at number 22. So that sets up, if they both win this weekend, UNLV and Boise playing in the conference title game since Colorado went down this past weekend. Missouri at number 21. So I think this means that Army's out.
Yeah.
I think that's what this means. So I doubt they only fall one spot. So number 21 is Missouri. Texas A&M falls down to number 20. So they are down. So now Army will get another shot here in 2 weeks because they'll play Tulane, who's going to be in the top 20. And that will be a chance for them to jump back in. But, number 19 is BYU. Yeah, Army's not moving up this week, Trev. So, Army's out. So, but they looked really impressive in the fourth quarter against Notre Dame with their 35-point win. So, Army's out, and none of the other opponents jumped in. So, that's hurt Notre Dame's resume a little bit. 18 is Iowa State. So, we're getting to that Big 12 part of the show. It looks like Arizona State's obviously going to jump up a little bit. They were 21st last week, so they're definitely going to be 17th or higher. Iowa State's an interesting team. I just don't see it with them. Tulane Green Wave are 92 or 17. That puts them within striking distance of Boise if Boise loses, Trev.
Yeah.
So that'll be very interesting. 16 is Arizona State, so they had a 5-point jump.
Wow.
So I thought they might be a little bit higher. Their overall resume is not, they're hot, but their overall resume is not incredibly strong. So then obviously Bama and Ole Miss are going to stay in the top 15. Unbelievable. 15 is South Carolina. Wow. So yeah, they're not going to drop Alabama and Ole Miss down very far at all. Which it's kind of hard with South Carolina because yeah, they're playing hot now, but they've lost to both Alabama and Ole Miss.
Yeah.
And they have similar resumes. So I think we're going to see Bama and Ole Miss coming up here back to back to back would be my guess.
I'd be shocked if it wasn't.
Yep. So Clemson's going to be ahead of South Carolina. 14 is old. Clemson's going to get a nice bump. They were 17th last week. They're going to be at least 13th. Ole Miss falls to 14. Trev, that's 8-3. Where Clemson versus Bama is going to be really interesting, Trev, to see where they are, because I would assume SMU is going to be in now.
Yeah.
At 10-1, but does Clemson leap ahead of Bama with 0 good wins? That's the thing. They have good losses, I guess, to quality teams. Bama's at 13, so Clemson is going to jump ahead of all those teams. So Clemson, Trev, is now in a position where, with a win over South Carolina this weekend, they are right there knocking on the door of because here's the thing about this. Clemson has to lose to fall behind those teams now. If they beat South Carolina, there's no way that Bama moves ahead of them by beating Auburn, or Ole Miss bumps ahead of them of beating Mississippi State. Those are both worse teams than Clemson playing number 15 South Carolina.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see Clemson right here at 12 is my bet right now, Trev. So number 12, let's see how this one shakes out. Long pause. They're talking a lot about Bama right now, apparently. 12 is Clemson. So Clemson Tigers right there at number 12, Trevor. So Indiana will be in the top 11 right now. How far are they right at 11? Does SMU leap them this week? We're about to find out. But that's big for Clemson. If they can beat South Carolina, which won't be easy, they're going to have a really good shot to jump into that. They position Clemson for, hey, guys, if you win, we're going to give you a chance, So that's going to be really interesting for the Tigers this week. Really interesting. I can't say that I agree with that, because Clemson's one of those teams, like, their wins are worse than Indiana's, Penn State's. Like, they don't have any good wins.
Agreed.
Any good wins, Trev. So that's an very interesting one here. Number 11 is Boise State. So Indiana is going to stay in the top 10. I am a little surprised Boise didn't get a bigger jump, but that's what happens. They barely beat Wyoming this weekend.
Yeah, and
Wyoming's like 2-9.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they didn't.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, they beat Wyoming, who was 2-8 going into the game, and they beat them 17-13. So
and had to score late, I believe, to get the lead back. So they had a chance to really boost their opinion of themselves, and they didn't take it. I mean, they got the win, so they didn't fall, but they didn't jump. Like, they only went up one spot. With all those teams losing, they only went up one spot. So SMU is a big beneficiary. SMU and Indiana are both going to be in the top 10 right now.
Yeah.
Number 10 is Indiana. So they're number 10. Right now, Indiana would be in, I believe, Trevor, because 2 teams would lead them. So they'd be the 12th seed. Number 9, my guess is going to be SMU, would be my guess. Yep, SMU is number 9. Huge. That's a 4-spot jump for the Mustangs. That is big for them. And they're playing good football, Trev. They didn't just beat Virginia this weekend. They did what Boise State could not do, which is, you're not playing a very good team, but they smacked them.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't smack them quite the way Notre Dame did, but they smacked them very, very pretty good, and they're a pretty hot team right now. So SMU finally getting some respect for the season they're putting together, and they got a pretty good loss too. Number 8. Let's see now where does Georgia and Miami fall into this one? That's kind of that next one.
Yeah.
Number 8 is Tennessee.
Okay.
So that means Georgia's going to be back in the top 7. I wonder. Here's the question: does Georgia lead Miami this week? I don't know how. How does beating UMass cause you to jump? And all the teams that beat you just lost.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how that causes them to be ahead of. I think we're going to see Georgia 7, Miami 6 is what I think we're going to see. So let's see here real quick. Number 7 is the Georgia Bulldogs at 9-2. So then Miami's going to be 6, Trev. And so now we're going to find out here, where's Notre Dame and Penn State.
Here we go.
So, well, I'm guessing Miami's going to be 6. That was kind of my prediction there. So let's kind of see where. Come on, fellas, stop talking about it. You got a lot of Notre Dame fans waiting to hear what you guys have to say. But this is big for Miami because Miami, to me now, Travis, unless they get blown out by SMU, they're in. As long as don't get. I mean, look, they got a big game at Syracuse this weekend that they got to win first.
Yeah.
So let's not let's not move past that one. Number 6 is Miami, like we said. Let's not move past that one just yet. But if they beat Syracuse, that's a good resume builder for Miami, going on the road and beating an 8-3 Syracuse team who beat a top 25 UNLV team on the road.
I mean, there's a chance that Syracuse-Miami game might end in a final score of 65-62. I mean, legitimately. I mean, you could see potentially Heisman numbers from Cam Ward and Kyle McCord in that game because Miami's defense is not good.
It is not good. It is not good. So that's the moment of truth for Notre Dame, Trevor. We're going to find out, do they stay at 5 or do they go up to 5 or number 5 is Notre Dame. So they did not leap Notre Dame ahead of Penn State just yet. So, but now Notre Dame is 1 spot away from Penn State. And you're going to see Penn State here at number 4 at 10-1. But now that puts a lot of onus on Notre Dame to say, okay, you've got to do this against USC. Hey, we prepared you guys for this, that this could be the reasoning for that. But you've got your final common opponent this weekend opportunity against USC. And go out and beat USC convincingly like you have everybody else, and you're going to move up. Penn State is number 4. So top 4 remains the same, Trevor. You just have Notre Dame moving ahead of Texas 3, Ohio State 2, and Oregon number 1. So Notre Dame moves up a spot to number 6, and – Penn State's right there. They're now 1 step away from Penn State. Like, that's the thing you guys got to look at is they were 2 spots behind Penn State this past week. Now they're 1 spot behind Penn State. So if you have an opportunity, if you go handle business the way that you're supposed to handle business, you've got a shot to go do something this week, Trevor. So just initial thoughts of the overall, the top 25, Trev, anything that kind of stood out to you in the top 25? It doesn't have to be Notre Dame related just yet, but just anything overall that stood out to you.
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting that they put Clemson above Alabama. I think out of all of the things that happened outside of things that are Notre Dame related, that's really interesting because the committee has shown a history of what they're essentially weighing now. In my opinion, for the majority, I know this isn't the case for all of the top 25, but for the majority, especially inside of the top 15, they're weighing more who you lost to and what the eye test is versus your resume and quality wins. And I think that's an interesting precedent to set, if I'm being quite honest. Yes, losses have to be a factor. I agree in that. But seeing Clemson ranked that high is really interesting to me. Really interesting. I think that's probably my biggest takeaway so far of the rankings, kind of letting it digest a little bit, but that's going to be interesting.
To your point, Trev, the problem that I have with Clemson jumping up, and I'm not even opposed to it because there's a chance that Notre Dame could get Clemson at this point in time, and I want a little bit of payback for last year's game against Clemson. But the thing is, like, you're basically just saying, well, they have 2 losses, those other teams have 3, and they have lost furthest away. And because, like, you can't even say, like, they have good losses because both of Clemson's losses were blowouts. I mean, they got their butt kicked by Georgia 34-3, and they got their butts kicked by Louisville 33-21 at home. And Clemson, you don't even have ranked. They have a 10-point win over Virginia Tech since then. A 4-point win over Pitt, where you had to come from behind, and then you blew up the Citadel last week. Your best win is over 7-4 Pitt. Your next best win is probably over 5-6 Virginia Tech on the road. Like what's the win that you're looking at saying, and you've got a common opponent with Alabama. You both played Georgia, and you can say, well, yeah, Georgia only lost by a touchdown or by 4. But they were down 28-0 at one point in time. Well, I don't care. Bama was blowing Georgia out in the first half. Georgia came back. It was a close game in the first half with Clemson and Georgia, and they got blown out in the second half. I mean, that doesn't matter to me. I'm with you. I'm very surprised that Clemson got the love that they got. I mean, they're positioned to where, because they play such a good team this weekend, that if they win this weekend, which won't be easy, by the way, because I'm just not impressed with Clemson in recent weeks. They have not played good football to me. They're in position to jump right in if they beat South Carolina, which is really crazy to me when you look at their schedule. Like, that is a very soft schedule, Trevor. So that one surprises me a little bit. And I'm a little surprised. I think the other thing is, I think the Big 12 is getting majorly disrespected in these rankings. You go look at some of their non-conference wins. The Big 12 has some good non-conference wins. Their best team is 16th at 9-2, behind 3 SEC teams that have 3 losses. I'm not sure how I feel about that. You know what I mean? So that one was a little bit interesting to me too. Big 12 not getting a whole lot of respect here in these rankings.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think overall, I think if I'm looking at the rankings macro view, it's really disheartening when you go through and look at essentially quality wins don't carry as much weight as they should. And I think that's something that's really frustrating. Going back to the Clemson point of, yeah, I mean, I guess if your best win is over 7-4 Pitt, but Pitt is quickly showing that they were not the team that people thought they were when they were undefeated. They just got smacked by Louisville. I think it was like 31-0. I'm almost positive. I think Pitt was held out of the end zone. And it's just one of those things where, like, it
was 37-9. Pitt scored late.
Okay.
37-9.
Okay.
Yeah. Real quick, Trev, they're kind of going over the rankings or the matchups. As of right now, Notre Dame would host SMU based on where the rankings are, and then they would play right now they have Texas projected to be the number 2 seed. So as of right now, Notre Dame would be the 7 seed because the ACC champ and the Mountain West champ, Boise State, would both jump ahead of them. So they would slide down to 7 and play SMU, and then the winner of that game would play Texas. That's probably not how it's going to go, because you're going to have either SMU or Miami gets beat. So you're going to see one of those 2 teams is going to have to lose. You know, Texas still has to play Georgia. So the way the rankings are right now, they're probably not going to finish this way. But Ohio State has a great path right now. They have Ohio State losing to Oregon. They play Arizona State in the first round, Boise State in the second round, and then they get a third matchup against Oregon in the semifinals. So I think what that would happen is I think that would flip. I think you'd just see Ohio State as the number 1 and Oregon as the number 5. But the Big Ten, like, it's amazing. The head of the committee is a current sitting AD in the Big Ten, and the Big Ten is just getting rewarded for, like, majorly, including having 2 teams in there that just had really soft schedules this year, really soft schedules. So they are hooking the Big Ten up bad. I actually don't have a problem with the Oregon-Ohio State ones because they have both played good schedules.
Yeah.
I have no problem with that one. But the Penn State-Indiana one is very interesting. But, yeah, it's an interesting look, Trev. So, first of all, what do you think about that matchup? We'll dive more into this, what it means for Notre Dame and some more. But just initially, what would your thoughts be on that potential matchup between SMU and Notre Dame?
I like it. I mean, SMU, they're hot right now. And it would be one of the more high-powered offenses that Notre Dame has faced this season. And I think it'd be a really fun matchup. I do like the fact that it is a Southern team coming up to play Notre Dame in South Bend in the middle of December. I think that's going to play a little bit of a factor as well. And then, barring Notre Dame winning in the first round and going to play Texas on a neutral field, that's going to be a matchup, if that does play out the way that it does, it's going to be a matchup that turns a lot of heads. Because on one hand, you have a Notre Dame team who, yes, they had the loss to Northern Illinois. They've since rattled off 9 straight. Not a single one of them has been close. Yes, Louisville was a 7-point game, but as we've always and have already alluded to, Notre Dame had the lead for 53 minutes of gameplay, right? So we can just say that it was closer on the scoreboard than it was out on the field. And then you have a Texas team who has yet to have a ranked win. Now, if you're counting wins over teams that you played who were ranked at the time, because I know some people do that, then Texas has
The committee
2.
doesn't. The committee doesn't.
Yeah.
They've said that it's only who's ranked right now.
Okay. Then, yeah, Clemson. Then Texas doesn't have any ranked wins. They have their first opportunity to get a ranked win this weekend. Now, I do think if Texas A&M loses to Texas, I think there's a good chance that they fall out of the top 25. So then you can look at it and potentially say that Clemson doesn't have, or Texas doesn't have a win over a single ranked opponent until they play, who would it be, Georgia in the SEC championship game. So I think it'd be interesting. That would be a really fun matchup to track and really fun to talk about throughout the week as it happens. So as of right now, I think that's a pretty favorable matchup for Notre Dame, especially in the first round. I would like Notre Dame's odds against SMU in the first round at home in South Bend.
I know a lot of people are upset with Indiana staying ahead in the top 10 because of their loss this last weekend, which I understand. Indiana didn't stay in the top 10 because they think that they're necessarily a top 10 team. They stay in the top 10 because you had 2 SEC teams with way worse losses than the one Indiana had. So there's that. And then after Indiana at number 10, who are you going to put ahead of them? Like, what's the big win that Boise State has that has you saying they should be ahead of Indiana? What's the big win that Clemson has that makes you think they should be ahead of Indiana? So part of this is just, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Where are you going to drop them? You can't drop them behind 3 lost teams in the SEC, and you can't say, hey, they have a weak schedule, and then put 9-2 Clemson, who has an even worse schedule and even worse wins, ahead of them. So I think that's the challenge of the committee is after the top 6, I think there's a lot of question marks about where to place teams. I don't know that I necessarily agree with Tennessee being ahead of SMU, but I'm not shocked by it because they were ahead of them last week. I don't, again, I think you're seeing the ACC not getting the respect, in my opinion, that it deserves when you look at how their teams matched up against the other Power 5 teams, especially in matchups against the Big Ten and the SEC. We're watching Florida, battle these SEC teams week after week, upset some of them, and I watched Miami beginning of the year just beat the mess out of them. So, but they're not getting any credit for that. They're not getting any credit for, North Carolina going on the road and beating Minnesota, in a similar fashion to what Penn State just did to Minnesota. So thought that was pretty interesting too. I think the ACC and the Big 12 are getting a lot of disrespect, in my opinion, from the committee, with the exception of Clemson, who has probably one of the weaker ACC resumes, because when you consider who they play. But you can't do the whole hypothetical of Clemson had so-and-so schedule, because that's not how it should work. I don't think it should work that way.
Right.
You can only beat the teams you have. But when you're talking about, 9-2 Clemson, what's the reasoning for having 9-2 Clemson ahead of 9-2 Arizona State? They've got better losses? Because Arizona State's got better wins. Arizona State beat number 19 BYU this past weekend in the game they controlled for 60 minutes. I mean, they kind of let BYU get in like real late, but it wasn't a game they ever were close to losing. So what's your justification for having Arizona State at 16? Well, they have bad losses. I care more about who you beat, Trevor. And what you're saying is that they're putting a lot of stock in who you lost to. Texas is number 3 a lot because of who they lost to. Penn State's number 4 because of who they lost to. Notre Dame's number 5 in spite of who they lost to. Because if they didn't lose to Northern Illinois, there's no question that they'd be ranked ahead of Penn State. If Notre Dame's lost, let's say instead of Northern Illinois, Notre Dame played Tennessee that weekend or Georgia that weekend and lost by 2 points, they'd probably be ranked 3rd right now because of who they beat and how they beat teams. Notre Dame ranks number 1 nationally in biggest margin of victory. They moved up into that number 1 spot last weekend. And so, I mean, they're clearly putting a lot of stock in who you lost to in this, even except for Georgia. Georgia's the only team that's getting any credit to me for who you beat. Georgia and Tennessee. Everybody else, it's who you lost to. Well, I should say this. Everyone outside of the SEC is getting credit for who you lost to. The SEC, they're doing the whole, well, look who they beat stuff when they should be doing that for everybody. So I think that's one of the flaws that I see in the rankings, Trev. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I'm in the same boat as you are. I think it's really frustrating to see a committee put so much value on who you lost to. Again, and I said it at the start of the show, losses are a factor, not the factor, right? I think to me, you are more of a football team based on who you beat, in my opinion. Like, especially if your good wins and margin of victory outweigh that specific loss. Now, there does come a time when, like, the amount of losses that you have, you know what I'm saying, will play a factor. Because, like, if the case was only who you beat, Florida should also be ranked somewhere in the top 20. You know what I mean? But that's just not how it works. But it is frustrating. Look, with the IU thing, and I understand some people's frustration with this, but it's more of a principle thing. You can't put a 10-1 IU team below an 8-3 Alabama team. You just can't. Because that is, and I know there's some people who talk about, well, the SEC fans are this and the Big Ten fans are this. And it's like, look, you cannot convince me that a 10-1 team should be ranked below an 8-3 team without using a hypothetical argument of, well, if they played at a neutral site or if so-and-so played so-and-so schedule. Now, the one thing that I will say is I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility to say that if, playing out some sort of hypothetical scenario, if Alabama and Ole Miss didn't get upset this weekend, IU would not be ranked in the top 10. They are ranked in the top 10 because of those losses. Like we said at the start of the show, IU probably benefited the most, or one of the most, of all of the teams that lost this weekend, because especially by the margin that they lost by, the eye test, like the athleticism was very lopsided. I mean, IU's whole identity was being letting Curtis Rourke go out and throw all over defenses, and he had 32 passing yards after the first drive and finished the game with like 68. So it's just, I get it. I understand the frustration, but again, you can't put a 10-1 team below an 8-3 team because you think that the 8-3 team would beat them on a neutral field. Like, it's just, and who knows? I don't know if you can say that Alabama would beat IU on a neutral field. They just lost to 6-4 Oklahoma by 21.
Trev, I was having this conversation with somebody today. They were like, how can you, if Indiana played Alabama's schedule, their record would be such and such and such and such. And I'm like, how can you say that to me? Because basically said if Alabama had Indiana's schedule, they'd be 10-1. And I said, how do you know that? How is losing to Vanderbilt any different than losing to Minnesota? How is losing to Vanderbilt any different than losing to Nebraska? How is losing to Oklahoma? I'm telling you right now, if Oklahoma and Nebraska played, I'd put my money on Nebraska. So let's not act like, it's just that it's kind of that lazy narrative about, well, the SEC is so hard and it's just such a tough league that they're even losing to 6-5 teams. That's nonsense. The reason that you have all these teams with 2 losses is because there's just not a lot of great teams in that league this year. There are no great teams in that league this year, in my opinion. And that's why you're seeing them fall. Where like the Big Ten, you can say, why is the Big Ten not in the same situation as those other leagues? Is it because Oregon and Ohio State played terrible schedules? No, that's not it at all. Because those teams have had to play comparable teams. I mean, Ohio State has a win over a top 10 Penn State team. Ohio State has a win over a top 10 Indiana team, and their only loss is a road loss at the number 1 team in the country. You look at Oregon and their schedule they've had to play this year. They beat number 2 Ohio State. They beat number 22 Illinois on the road or at home this year by 29. They went on the road and beat Wisconsin in an ugly win. They won, and they beat number 11 Boise State this season. So, and they've had to play teams that are like those 6-5 type of teams like these other leagues are playing, and they've won all their games. So you don't tell me that these teams are there because, they play soft schedules. I think Penn State's played a soft schedule. I think that Indiana's played a soft schedule. I don't think that Oregon and Ohio State have. And so, and I just feel like, but the reason that they're 10-1 and an 11-0 is because they're actually top teams, whereas these other, and I even put Georgia right now at top of the SEC because, they've lost 2 games, but at least they've lost to good teams, where those other teams are getting beat by middle-of-the-road teams. And so I think that's a big part. You say, Penn State's no good, and I think Penn State's overrated, but Penn State has played teams that are comparable to Vanderbilt and Kentucky and Florida and Oklahoma and beat those teams. Right. So, I mean, that's the reality of it. And that's why I think I do think the committee's job this week was a lot harder. I think there's some clear misses, in my opinion, from where they're at with their rankings, Trev. But I understand the struggle this week of ranking teams. Because there's a lot of things that put you in a bind So, like, if you're going to have, if you're, you say, hey, move South Carolina way up because they're red hot right now. Well, I don't think it should be based on who's the hottest right now. It should be based on who is the best team looking over the course of the season. And yes, South Carolina is quote unquote hot right now, but their resume is still not as good as Ole Miss and Alabama's, because in a lot of ways, you're still building South Carolina's schedule more on who they lost to than you are kind of who they beat. Because right now, they lost to Alabama, they lost to Ole Miss. They beat Texas A&M, who's 20. They beat Missouri, who's 24. I don't think Missouri should be ranked, in my opinion. I don't care what they say. Missouri's not a very good football team, but they're where they are because they had good losses, so to speak, except for the LSU loss. But you can't put them ahead of Ole Miss and Alabama, who have identical records and both beat them. You know what I mean? So I do understand the struggle of moving those teams up, or not being able to move South Carolina up. But like you said, I just have a hard time with what's the justification for Clemson other than they just have fewer losses, because you still got to beat somebody. Because otherwise, why not move Arizona State way up at 9-2? Why not move Iowa State up at 9-2? Why not move Tulane way up at 9-2? Why not move UNLV up at 9-2? It's got to be about who you played, right? Well, okay. Some of those teams I just mentioned have better wins than anything Clemson's done. So what's going to be interesting, somebody did say South Carolina should be in if they beat the Clemson Tigers. That's something else I wonder. Are they putting Clemson there knowing that they can – because here's the thing about Clemson, Trevor. Clemson at 12, you do two things. One is if you do beat South Carolina and finally get that good win over an 8-14, by the way, but if you do finally get that good win, now you're in position to say you've justified their ranking. If they lose to South Carolina, that's one more notch in South Carolina's belt. Is that enough for them to jump ahead of Alabama or Ole Miss? Could that be the reasoning for putting Clemson where they said, to kind of say, hey, listen, these teams are kind of whimpering down the stretch a little bit. South Carolina's red hot. They're better than they were when you teams beat them back in October. And look what they just did to number 12 Clemson. I wonder if that could be part of this conversation too, Trevor, when you talk about where they place Clemson here at 9-2.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting what they decide to do with South Carolina, especially if they go and beat Clemson. For me, and this is also assuming that Alabama beats Auburn in the Iron Bowl on Saturday, because now with this Alabama team, I don't know what is within the realm of possibility and what isn't. If I look at two teams and they have identical records, so both South Carolina and Alabama would be 9-3, and one of them has the head-to-head win over the other, it's really hard for me to understand. Well, not understand, but it's hard for me to justify the team who lost being put ahead. That's why last week I had an issue with SMU being put ahead of BYU. Now, it ended up that the committee got it right because BYU lost this week. But it's when I have two 9-3 teams and Alabama does still have a win over Georgia and they beat South Carolina, it would be tough for me to give the green light to South Carolina to then jump Bama. Because then I would be using the same argument that the committee does of who has better losses.
Right. Well, in theory, I have no problem with teams with identical record if the team that won the head-to-head is ranked lower. In theory. I don't know that I buy – I tend to agree with you on the South Carolina thing, because when I look at it, South Carolina has two good losses to Ole Miss and Bama. One of them was not competitive, and they have a bad loss, in my opinion, which was a home loss to LSU. That's not a good loss. It's a 7-4 unranked team. You barely beat Old Dominion. You do have a blowout road win over Kentucky. You did have a blowout road win over Oklahoma. That's fine. You did beat Vanderbilt on the road convincingly. And so those are games you look at, okay, the head-to-head, Bama gets the nod, but what about other factors? And I do think you need to look past head-to-head and see if other factors are more significant. Like the Bama one, you say, okay, Bama won 25-27 in Tuscaloosa. So they get the nod, point for Bama. Okay, their records are the same, but what about other comparable things? Okay, well, Vanderbilt lost, or Alabama lost to Vanderbilt. South Carolina blew Vanderbilt out. Alabama lost to Oklahoma by 21 points. South Carolina blew Oklahoma out. So like there's some, and okay, well that's fine. Missouri or South Carolina barely beat Missouri, and Alabama blew them out. Like you have to be willing to look at the entirety of the resume, and if one team with a similar record has a significantly better overall resume than the team that beat them head to head, I want the team with the better overall resume. But I don't know that you can definitely make that case with Alabama and South Carolina, except for this. The argument that Bama has in their favor, other than head to head, is we had a more convincing win over Missouri. The argument that South Carolina has is no, we blew out a team that blew you out, and we blew out another team that beat you by 5 and had a lead on you for almost the entire game. So that's where I say in this instance, and then if you add in a win over Clemson, now all of a sudden you say, okay, their overall resume is better. The only place where Bama really has that edge is they have the better individual win, the top win. You could argue that the next couple good wins belong to South Carolina. How they're playing now factors in. So it's going to be an interesting thing to do, because then it's also like, how do you justify the Ole Miss one? Because Ole Miss blew South Carolina out. It's like 27-9. Wasn't even close. But then with Ole Miss, they have 3 awful losses. So all these teams have very flawed resumes. And so I actually kind of understand why it's going to be why it is a little bit challenging to,
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, this week I definitely did not envy the committee with some of the decisions that they were going to have to make. And like I said at the start of the show, we are kind of coming up on crunch time here where, there's only going to be 2 more shows, two more rankings that come out. The ones after this weekend and then the Sunday selection show after conference championship weekend. So it's going to be, again, like I said, it's going to be really interesting to see where teams fall. I think the thing that is frustrating, and this has kind of always been my issue with the committee since the college football playoff started, is some requirements you look at for certain teams and others you look at for others. And I think that's the hardest part, is there's not an overall benchmark report that you can look at for everybody and everybody's evaluated, all things being equal. And I think that's what makes it so hard sometimes to break down and analyze these rankings, because you say, well, yes, but for these teams and for this set of rankings, this factor did apply. But then for these 2 rankings, these factors did not apply. And it makes it really, really interesting. It's one of those situations where, like, I wish I could sit down with somebody on the committee and ask them, it's like, hey, like, what was the thought process here? Why is Clemson ahead of Alabama? Is it just because one loss column says 2 and the other one says 3? Well, how much weight do you put on quality wins? Right.
Right.
And the answer is, at least in the top 12, the answer is not that much. Or Penn State wouldn't be 4th, or Clemson wouldn't be 12th. So it's interesting what they decide to do. So going to be really interesting to see what unfolds the next 2 weeks.
I want a couple things, Trev. Obviously, as we talked about, we said before the rankings were released that we thought the ACC was going to benefit the most from the SEC getting knocked out this weekend.
Yeah,
absolutely true.
Yep.
Miami climbed up 1 spot to number 6 thanks to Indiana getting beat. But the big one was, so that didn't affect Miami much. But what did impact Miami was, or the ACC, was SMU going from 13 to 9 because of all those SEC losses. And then, of course, Clemson going up from 17 to 12, leaping 2 SEC teams, Alabama and Ole Miss. So the ACC certainly obviously benefiting greatly from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the winners of the day, because of what happened in all of the games on Saturday, were the ACC and IU. Like, those were the clear winners of what happened. Because, like, the stuff at the top, I mean, the things from rankings 1 through 5, like that, we figured that wasn't going to change, right? There was some talk that Notre Dame would possibly jump Penn State. I was under the impression that they just weren't going to. They love Penn State. And I don't think Notre Dame beating a service school, albeit this was the same committee that ranked them 19th, I don't think that anything was going to happen, barring Penn State losing, for Notre Dame to jump them. So the top 5 didn't change, and that came to no surprise to me at all.
Mm-hmm.
But IU and the ACC benefited greatly from all of the chaos that happened this weekend, for sure.
Mm-hmm. I'll say this on Penn State as we get close to wrapping this up. I'll say this about Penn State. I think I'm not as surprised by this move as some other people are. I'm not. And here's why. I think you guys are looking at it from a point of view of what should be done, and I totally get that. But look at it this way. What was the rankings when they first came out? Notre Dame was 10th. Right? When
I think Penn State
rankings came out.
And I think Penn State was 6th.
Right. So Penn State was, let's see here. So when the first rankings came out, Penn State was 6, Notre Dame was 10.
Yep.
When the second rankings came out, Penn State jumped up to 4, and Notre Dame was 8. So there was no movement in the distance between them. Last week, Penn State stayed at 4, Notre Dame jumped up to 6, so they closed the gap by 2, and then this past week they closed the gap by 1. So I have this notion that they're just not going to move Notre Dame over Penn State. I don't agree with that. I think what they've done is they continue to get Notre Dame closer and closer and closer. And now let's see what they do against USC. So what we said at the beginning, if they go out and beat USC convincingly, then the committee can say, hey, look, now we have all the evidence. And the evidence is clear. Notre Dame is better than Penn State. So I'm actually not as discouraged by, it's just not going to happen as some of you are. I'm actually okay with it. I would change it, but I'm okay with it. You just need to see. Let's see what they do this weekend. That's going to be the big key.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, and I do. I have a fear of what the committee and how they're going to evaluate it. I hope that they're evaluating liked opponents, because like I've sat and talked about what I think and believe the committee is going to evaluate, and for me, it feels like the goalpost is changing each week, because it feels like I don't know what they're evaluating. Some weeks it's who you lost to, other weeks it's who you beat, and other weeks it's how you won, and so it's interesting, because if the argument, well, IU, we rank them that high because they're blowing everybody out. It's like, okay, so you evaluate opponents based on how they win. Well, Penn State just beat a 6-4 football team by 1 point. It's like, well, that we're not counting it now, And so for me, it's just tough to, and let me say, like, I understand and I get everything that you're saying, because the gap is closing, which is really awesome to see. I just don't know if Notre Dame beating a top 20 team by 35 points, if that's not enough to elevate them above Penn State. I don't know if beating a 6-5 USC team will, despite it being a common opponent.
Well, we have seen common opponent matter. But again, what I'm saying is I think we're looking at it, they would have to move Notre Dame up 2 whole spots to beat Penn State. You see what I'm saying? Where I look at it as like that win got them closer. You know what I mean? Like that's how I look. Because we've seen a 1-loss Big Ten team that lost to Ohio State be ranked ahead of Notre Dame, right? Well, Indiana wasn't. So that's kind of where I'm at with it on this one, Trev. So we'll find out. I mean, we'll find out a week from today. We're going to know for sure. And hopefully Notre Dame does what they need to do this weekend. But at the end of the day, what this says is where Notre Dame is now 5, win and you're in. Win and you're hosting. That's where it's at. Win and you're hosting. There's no scenario like you could maybe see them fall to 8 if Georgia beats Texas and Texas stays ahead of Notre Dame in a close game. But at the very least, they're hosting. If you win, you're in. If you win, you're hosting. And that's ultimately what matters. And so for Notre Dame, they don't need to care about any of this. They just need to focus on beating USC.
Yeah.
And that'll be the key.
Yeah.
That'll be the key. So before we go, Trev, we have a couple super chats I wanted to get to. We have one from AST 12321. Do we have any concerns? Thank you for that. Do we have any concerns on the secondary not facing any good passing offenses since Louisville for the playoff? Will play versus USC answer that question? They don't answer the question to a degree. I mean, USC is a good pass offense from a yard standpoint, but their other metrics aren't very good. They rank very low in yards per attempt. Their quarterback rating isn't very high. Plus, a lot of the passer numbers that they've had were done by Miller Moss, not Jaden Maeva. I mean, he's not throwing the ball the same amount of the same production as what Miller Moss did.
Yeah.
I mean, they're averaging on the season, Trev, 285 yards per game. Maeva's passed for 259 and 221. He's averaging less than 7 yards a completion or an attempt. So it's a different type of pass game. It's a different offense than what it was under Miller Moss.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of USC's passing numbers come from volume, not efficiency. It's just because they throw the ball so darn much. Right now, one thing I will say and I have an article coming out about this later, but one thing that is going to be really interesting to watch is the individual matchups between the corners and the wide receivers, because this is going to be one of the more athletic and deeper receiving rooms that Notre Dame has faced this season. Now, it's going to be a question whether Jaden Maeva can get them the football, but it's going to be interesting to see how they do handling like their ability to make plays if they are able to catch the football, pending that they can be facilitated the football, because USC has 5 wide receivers right now, all with over 30 receptions. So they distribute the ball very similar to what Notre Dame does. They don't have like just like that one guy like they did when they had Jordan Addison back in 2022. But it's to a degree, yes, it will answer some of the questions, but Tyler Shuck was a much better passer than what Jaden Maeva is. So it's going to be
receivers are better than USC's are too.
Yeah.
None of USC's receivers as good as Ja'Cory Brooks.
No.
In my opinion. Yeah.
No,
Michael
I
S.
agree.
Michael S. with a super chat. Has Notre Dame played any teams with solid defense and a talented offense equal or better to SC? Yes. Texas A&M, Louisville, Georgia Tech, all better than USC, and Army is also a better team than USC. So, yes, they have. And then he says, also from Michael S., Lincoln Riley's coaching for his reputation. What does that bold for Notre Dame? I don't think it means anything. It's going to be about, I mean, if the USC players cared about Lincoln Riley coaching for his reputation, they'd have beat UCLA by more than 6. This is going to be about the players in the field, playing hard, executing, and who has the better team. And the team that plays the hardest and executes the best is going to win this football game. And whether that's USC or Notre Dame, but I don't think it's going to have anything to do with Lincoln Riley's reputation. It's about preparation and execution. That's what it's about. And Michael S. says, does SC change style and run more? We'll see. I talked about this, Michael, on yesterday. So if you want to get my thoughts on that, listen to yesterday's show. I talked a lot about what they should do. Then the last one from Irish for Life 99. So are we Michigan fans this weekend? I think I just threw up in my mouth a little bit typing it. No, I'm not, because I don't want to duck Ohio State. I want to play Ohio State. I want Notre Dame to play Georgia this year. I want Notre Dame to play Ohio State this year. I want them to play Oregon this year. And let's find out truly if Notre Dame is because if Notre Dame wins because they got a clean path and a lucky path, and you're just going to hear that all off season. Well, they didn't have to play Georgia. They didn't have to play Ohio State. They didn't have to play Texas. They didn't have to play Oregon. If you think this is a championship caliber team, you shouldn't be hoping for any easier paths. Now, that could help Notre Dame get into the 5 seed. That could certainly help with that. And that would. If Michigan beats Ohio State this weekend, Notre Dame's going to be the 5 seed. Because Penn State falls behind. Because now their good loss isn't as good anymore.
True. Yeah,
but so if you care about getting that one, then sure, go for it. Go for it. But I just can't bring myself to doing that. Although I will say this, that's how much I dislike Ryan Day. That I might actually root for Michigan this weekend. That's how much I dislike Ryan Day. So, yeah, I could see that. Well, Trev, that's it, man. Why don't you go ahead and take us out of here? Everybody, thanks for joining us. Trev and Vince will be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock. I'll be back on Friday. I won't talk to you guys again before Friday. So for all of you, have a very, very happy Thanksgiving. And would certainly appreciate prayers tomorrow. As most of you know, I will be my grandmother's funeral is tomorrow, and I'll be her services tomorrow, and I will be giving the eulogy. So it's something that that's what I'll be spending the rest of the night working on. So I certainly appreciate some thoughts and prayers for that. But I will see you all on Friday. Trev, why don't you go ahead and take them out of here?
Yeah, absolutely. Ryan, good luck with everything the rest of the week. Listen, if you guys are traveling for the holidays, travel safe, enjoy time with friends and family. For us at Irish Breakdown, you guys know what to do. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you know when we are going live. Like Brian said, Vince and I will be back tomorrow. So make sure you share this podcast with your friends and family. Show it to them around the dinner table at Thanksgiving. Let them know what's going on here at Irish Breakdown. So until next time, I'm Trevor. That's Brian. And we'll see you back here next time on the Irish Breakdown podcast.